The way that people responded in caring for each other. You know, the morning after, in front of that church, white people, black people, hugging each other, wiping away each other's tears, praying together, kneeling together, walking across the bridge that Sunday, vigil turning out, that response, which the world noticed, and the world really needed to see that rather than violence and destruction, a community responded to a horrific act with love and care for each other. And so that, you know, you're never the same after a tragic event or after a major event. You're never the same. However you change, you're not the same. And what happened in Charleston was we changed for the better. And the state did. We clearly understood our love for each other, our respect for each other, our care and concern for each other. And that, you know, that will always be in a tragic, awful circumstance, that out of that came a reminder to the people of this community and our state what is important. Respect each other, care for each other, love each other, protect each other.
That was former Charleston Mayor Joseph Riley reflecting on the aftermath of the horrific events 1 year ago when 9 people were brutally slain during a Bible study at historic Mother Emanuel AME Church here in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. Hello, I'm Beryl Dakers, welcoming you to this very special edition of Palmetto Scene, where we will talk about the ramifications of this tragedy with a very special group of people who were intimately concerned. I'd like for you to meet now our guests, who include the Reverend Dr. Betty Days Clark, who is the current pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church, appointed some 6 months after the tragedy. Next to her is former North Carolina Senator Malcolm Graham, who is the brother of slain parishioner Cynthia Hurd. And we have CNN commentator and former South Carolina Representative Bakari Sellers, along with the Reverend Joseph Darby, presiding elder of the Beaufort District of the AME Church. Welcome all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elder Darby, I'm going to begin with you because as a longtime Charleston resident and community leader, you were right here on the scene. You were very intimately involved in the aftermath of this tragedy. We heard what the mayor said. From your perspective, though, how does one even begin to provide leadership and direction when something this unexpected and horrific occurs?
Well, I think leadership and direction are incumbent upon those who are supposed to be in those positions. I think that the mayor did an admirable job of that, the chief of police, Reverend Goff, who was here at that time. I think leadership, though, endures past the moment. You had a crisis-level outpouring of love, affection, and support. But a year later, there's not that much that's changed in Charleston. And so I think the jury is out on whether or not it made an enduring change to the city, or whether it's just going to be another extended kumbaya moment.
Dr. Clark, let's look at you. You came into this situation 6 months after the fact. What were your expectations upon assuming the pastorate of this church, and what did you actually find?
Well, when I assumed this position, I came because I knew there were broken, hurting people, and I wanted to have an opportunity to share the love of Christ with them. When I came, I found people with open arms and open hearts. They embraced me, they accepted me, and we're journeying together.
Did you find the church itself in a position of readiness to move forward, or were we still so broken and hurt that that was the major part of your charge?
Well, there's something unique about grieving, and that is that we each move at a different pace. And even though today we may be in a celebratory manner, tomorrow we may be full with tears all over again. And so I found a congregation, and yet still have a congregation filled with mixed emotions.
We'll explore that a little more as we go along. Mr. Graham, as we look at your role here, for all of us, this was a very poignant, a very heartbreaking experience, but for you and the survivors and the family members of those that were slain, it was certainly more personal, more visceral. How do you process this and move on?
Well, we process it by taking one day at a time. What happened on June 17th of last year was a gut blow, not only to the families involved, brothers and sisters and mothers and cousins, but a gut blow to this community as a whole. And not only was it an attack on those individuals who were there, it was an attack on the Christian church. It was an attack on a race of people. It was an attack on humanity. And so we process that by taking one day at a time and acknowledging what happened that night. And what happened that night was that 9 individuals, 5 other were terrorized by someone who didn't like them simply because of the color of their skin. They died that night simply because they happened to be there and that they were black. And I think that we have to acknowledge that. We have to embrace what the mayor said, but then we have to seek understanding and create what I call healthy tension by discussing exactly what happened and the ramification for what occurred that night. And so there's a number of emotions that family members are dealing with: the loss of their loved ones, the church being attacked, their faith being attacked, their community being attacked, and how we respond to all those in terms of making sure that each and every one of us move forward together. But one thing that we have to do is acknowledge exactly what happened that night, and that those individuals, those who survived, this community was attacked. And a race of people that look like me was attacked that night simply because of the color of our skin in 2015. And so that cannot be swept away by I forgive. It cannot be swept away by a community coming together and embracing their humanity. That's what we are supposed to do. We should love one another. We should respect one another. We should come together and to acknowledge that something bad happened and hug one another and love one another, because black, white, rich, poor, young, old, we're all in this together. But once that moment is over, then it's time for an examination. And it's time to look at the man in the mirror and to critique what we see. And we have to do that with what happened on June 17th. We have to take a look at what happened that night and be strong enough to acknowledge.
Mr. Sellers, you are a former legislator in the House of Representatives here in South Carolina. You were a colleague of the late Reverend Clemente Pinckney. You are also, as I say it, the heir apparent of the civil rights activism, in the sense that you've been brought up with this. And very early on, you addressed the fact that we could not just look at this event as the act of one isolated racist or madman, that we had to look at it in the broader context of the discussion of race in this country today.
Well, I mean, that's important, because one of the things that struck me initially was how can someone who was 21 years old, being raised in Richland and Lexington County, have more hate in his heart than George Wallace did? And we have to understand the culture, similar to what Senator Graham was talking about, that created this monster. And you know, for me, if you're looking through the prism of history, looking through the prism of African American history and the civil rights struggle, you think back to moments throughout our history, and you remember that we're not that far away from 1968 and the Orange Grove Massacre. We're not that far away from, Medgar Evers and Emmett Till. We're not that far away from 4 little girls being bombed in a church in Little Rock. So, you think about all of these things, and you put them in context, and you understand that we've made a lot of progress, but we still have yet a ways to go. And my fear is that what happened on that fateful day of June 17th, and my friend and his sister and the other individuals who were affected so much, my fear is that we have that moment, and some proceeds are given to a church, or some proceeds are given to family members, and that's it. And we don't respect their memories enough to fully grasp and understand what they died for. They died for more than just the Confederate flag to come down, although that's a step. I mean, they died so that we can recommit ourselves to those fundamental truths and those not so tangible ideals of peace, love, justice, and truth. And that quest, although exhausting, is just filled with the blood of those 9 soldiers, and we cannot let their deaths be in vain.
Well, we saw in the immediate aftermath a spate of town meetings, discussions, rallies. Everyone was getting together for reconciliation talks and around the table kind of thing. And of course now, as we are at the anniversary of the 1 year, we're seeing certainly a resurgence of the observances. But are you suggesting that that may be sort of just the outside view here, that it's not something that's carried through, that we are not dealing with the issues that we should be dealing with?
Well, there have been some conversations. I think that's a byproduct. It's not on a large-scale organized basis. But a lot of what was wrong back then is still wrong now. Downtown is gentrifying. African Americans being pushed to the suburbs or to other places so that other colors of families can move in. Our school district just balanced its budget after a financial problem that they created by closing an overwhelmingly black high school over the vehement objections of the people in that community. If you read the papers and look at TV, you still have the same kind of vitriol that you had before. We've just got an incident that was reported today of a police officer who responded to what happened by 4 or 5 days later, posting a picture of himself wearing Confederate flag underwear on Facebook. So there needs to be some, not only just dialogue, there needs to be an effort by all of those people of goodwill who came pouring out of the woodwork, and some of whom have poured right back into the woodwork, to say we are going to do things differently, we're going to demand more of our elected officials, we are going to have a lower tolerance for racial animus being stirred up by people running for public office. We're going to see if public policies can reflect the kind of progress that's needed. If we don't have those things, then this is just another episode in which Charleston comes together to meet an immediate crisis, as it has happened with Hurricane Hugo, and then slowly drifts back apart. And this, the anniversary, will be an annual time when people paint habitat houses and do other cute things to talk about how together we all are before we go back home.
Who's the onus on? Who is the onus on to keep the dialogue going, to mandate the changes that you're talking about?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because I think that the onus is on us all. I mean, I don't think it's on a particular individual. I mean, I dare not think that one individual has to bear the burden of bringing an entire community or state together, because although we can look at the predicament that Charleston is in today versus where it was 365 days ago, the fact of the matter is Charleston is just a microcosm of what's going on in this country. And we talk about the schools in Charleston and African Americans still being left behind here in Charleston, even in light of that incident. Well, you understand that that's prevalent throughout the state of South Carolina, where African Americans, for example, I give you one statistic, the infant mortality rate of African Americans is nearly double that of white South Carolinians. In fact, you're more likely to have a healthier baby being born in Botswana, Cuba, in some third world countries than being born black here in South Carolina. So, I mean, these are some of the issues that we're still grappling with. We still have a court of shame. I mean, we still have a stroke belt that overlaps the court of shame. I mean, we still have, you know, in the economy, when the economy is having a dip, you know, when white Americans get a cold, African Americans get the flu. And so, you know, it's tough sledding. And so the onus is on us all. But one thing that I have to say is Dylann Roof was not mentally ill. And that drives me crazy because it gives people a pass. Dylann Roof was racist. And those are two vastly different things. And until we begin to have the discussion and understand that racism is very real, Barack Obama got elected, but we ain't post-racial. Until we begin to actually have those discussions, and it is you said tenuous, I believe, but it's just downright difficult for some people to have that discussion.
And there's a hidden racism that still exists in our society nationwide.
Not so hidden anymore.
Well, not so hidden. I mean, Charleston was on full display. But in the criminal justice system, for an example, a young man in California got 6 months in jail for raping an unconscious woman. He was white. An African-American football player in Tennessee did the same type of thing, and he gets like 25 years in jail. You still get a quality education based on your zip code. If you're in a good zip code, you got great teachers, great school facilities. If you're in the wrong zip code, not so good teachers. The political system rewards the wealthy and major corporations at the expense of the poor and the middle class. Healthcare. Many states, South Carolina as well as North Carolina, did not accept Medicaid expansion, costing millions of folks health care, poor minority folks. And so whether it's the criminal justice system, the political system, the educational system, the employment system, there's an element of hidden racism that exists in all those systems that keep people of color black, not as blatant as a guy going into church and killing 9 folks and terrorizing 5 others, but every day, little by little, these elements of racism are in these systems. So I think it's up to the political class, the electorate, the voters, to take a vested interest in terms of public policy. Public policy is why the Confederate flag went up. Public policy is why it went down. But I'm here to say, though, if June 17th did not occur, the Confederate flag would still be flying today. And so we have to take an interest in public policy and voting, and we say it over and over again, the importance of voting to change system within our country.
What I hear you saying is that political expediency perhaps dictated the flags coming down, that we look at this, but that we as a people have not really experienced any sort of political change in our thinking, in our institutionalized behavior.
That's exactly what I'm saying. But for the death of 9 individuals and 5 others being terrorized, a race of people being attacked, the Christian church being attacked, humanity being attacked, the flag would still be flying today if those things did not occur last year this time. And so we have to acknowledge that and create what I call healthy tension around that fact.
Before we get to the healthy tension, did we need the healing experience, the coming together, in order to be able to project that, or were we simply putting off doing any kind of in-depth healing by having this atmosphere of love and forgiveness?
Well, while I don't disagree with my 3 brothers, the Confederate flag coming down gave me hope that change can happen. And change has already started within me. I'm looking at things differently. I'm not willing to turn away as fast as I once was. And so I see a change because I see the change that's happening in me. Now, I know we need to let our vote speak and speak very loud. But as a person of faith, I believe that we ought to walk out the faith we confess. And if I don't believe that change can come, then I have to examine what I really believe.
And I think that expression of faith is important. You know, it's good to remember that Jesus was not a flower child. Jesus was something of a revolutionary. He's made a comment about capitalism when he broke up folks doing business in the Lord's house. We have to have that right balance and do that kind of creative confrontation, and have to be careful in cases like this not to let healing take the place of progress. You know, if you break a leg, then nobody just comes by and says, I hope you'll feel better, and you know, anything like that. Or nobody just puts a cast on it and says, well, see you another time. You get therapy after that. You do things to create a state of wholeness, to restore or to repair. And that restoration and repair is not going on in America. And it's because we do have problems accepting some stuff. Flag came down from the State House, but it's still in Summerall Chapel at the Citadel in Charleston, flying next to the Virgin Islands flag, basically African-American nation. You've got a Dylann Roof here. You had the Aurora, Colorado shooting. You had the Sikh temple shooting in Michigan. You had Sandy Hook. And every time that happens, the person who does it is called a lone wolf. You have to kind of look. If all of those wolves look the same way, you're talking about a pack, and you're talking about a kind of behavior that needs to be analyzed. And you need to know what it is that makes basically and overwhelmingly young white men grow up with the anger that they will destroy their lives and destroy the lives of others for no apparent reason. There has to be something there, and America needs to explore how that fear of the other plays into that.
There are 2 points that I just wanted to follow up on, and I think that for me, in a very personal, familial manner, the Confederate flag coming down was a huge sigh, because I know that my father, like Reverend Darby, probably never thought they would live to see the day where the Confederate flag came down. So you understand that sigh, you understand that burden being alleviated, but the same lessons that I do learn from Reverend Darby are the lessons that drive me crazy, because I don't think we've learned them as a country. I don't think we learned them as a state, and that is that the journey doesn't end. You know, people like to put periods on the end of these sentences when we're talking about racial justice, but that there's no period at the end of this sentence. We haven't reached the point where we can see where this paragraph or where this story ends. I mean, we're still continuously fighting. And so while the Confederate flag coming down was a great verb or a great adverb or a great noun, it's not the period. It is not the end of this sentence. So we have to continue this journey, and that, I think, is what troubles so many of us sitting around this table today, or sitting in this place of worship today, because there are people in and out of the church, in and out of elected office, black and white, who for some reason believe that we came, we saw, we conquered, it happened, it's over. And there's one other just small nuance that bothers me, and forgive me for all the people watching from South Carolina, is implicitly in many of these questions that I get from here and around the country, it's as if Charleston somehow was better than Ferguson or Baltimore. And the black folk in Charleston are better than the black folk in Ferguson and Baltimore. And that's not the case. The anger manifested itself differently due to a different type of socioeconomic circumstances. I mean, and if we're going to really look at this, you have to be able to understand and diagnose the root cause of the pain or the outburst. And so each person has their own different set of circumstances. So to my friends who are watching, because I know I'll get a lot of criticism from my friends here in South Carolina, but if you got family in Ferguson and you have family in Baltimore, I mean, just rest assured that we are no better than them. Our communities went through tragedies, and how we responded is based upon our circumstances, but we are all in this fight to find our period to wrap it up together.
Can I put a little amen in there? It's a cultural thing, you know, and I wouldn't dare put myself into the thoughts and minds of the survivors of that tragedy. But we're in a culture that was the antebellum South. We're in a culture where people could be shot, raped, maimed, mutilated. Now, how do you live with that if you can't get away? And if you know if you kill the person that's doing it, you'll be killed. You learn to forgive and move on. You learn how to cope. There's still a coping mechanism in order in South Carolina, and that's not a virtue. That's a shame that there still has to be a coping mechanism.
On that point, I'm going to pause at this moment because our governor has been asked about the way South Carolina responded and has continually talked about the fact that our state met the test. Let's take a look.
South Carolina was tested last year, and they didn't have riots. They had vigils. They didn't have any sort of protests. They had hugs, and we saw it happen across the state. And what the country and the world saw were very passionate, good people that just wanted to help bring this back up. I mean, we had fallen to our knees, and it was about getting everyone to stand up again and lifting up those families and lifting up the survivors and getting them through it and getting all of us through it. I think that it'll be a long time before we truly heal, but I think that the key is to make sure that we never forget what we did in the weeks following June 17th. We never forget what we showed the world, and it was a true test for the state of South Carolina. And the people stepped up in a way that I couldn't have even imagined.
Dr. Clark, if indeed the citizens of South Carolina met the test, as the governor suggested, Mother Emanuel was leading that movement, how do you respond?
Well, I'm not sure that we saw it as a test. I think we saw it as a natural reflex. Our response was one that I believe came from the heart. In our saying, we forgive, it does not negate the responsibility that the person must bear who committed the crime. In saying we forgive, it frees us up to be able to live past today and have a hope for tomorrow.
You know, I hear the governor's comments, and I'm very respectful of her and respectful of the way she conducted herself during that week. She did a great job. However, as a brother, as a member of this church for some 50 years, family membership, humanity required us to come together and to respect one another and to support one another. But it also challenges us to do more. Faith without works is dead. And so we demonstrated strong faith. The church was amazing. But then there's some work that has to be done. And I think her statement doesn't acknowledge that there's work to be done. Her statement puts a period at the end of what happened in Charleston. And there can't be a period, there has to be a comma, saying that we got to do more, we have to acknowledge what happened that night. My problem is that there seems to be no acknowledgement of the lives that were lost in terms of their blackness.
That's a good, you know what, I was thinking about that because, you know, Governor Haley, who I, politically speaking, probably haven't said the most flattering things about her political career. I consider Governor Haley to be someone that I'm very social, very respectful towards because she holds the highest office in the state, but politically we couldn't disagree more. I give that preface to say that she did an amazing job that week. And regardless of what anybody may think, we see the political discourse in this country, and I'll put the fortitude and courage of Governor Nikki Haley up against anybody because she had to stand there and take that Confederate flag down. And she made that choice. That wasn't easy, and she knew there was going to be blowback. So kudos and much respect for that. But to your point about these individuals being given credit, this is where the challenge of Nikki Haley becoming a figure that transcends and displays true leadership, because I know what Clemente Pinckney dedicated his life to. When I was running for lieutenant governor in 2014, one of my last campaign stops was at an AME church in Walterboro, South Carolina. We had a fish fry, and we stood up there and railed against the number of people who don't have health care or access to health care in this state, and the fact that we needed to expand Medicaid. That was his life. His life was Jasper County, Charleston County, Beaufort County, along the I-95 corridor, in the corridor of shame. That's who he was. And then lastly, he was unapologetically black. You know, there was no ifs, ands, or buts about him. And to say that this is somehow over without recognizing or encompassing everything that this man was is a disservice. I just bumped into Jennifer and the girls at the post office randomly, and they still smile, and they still glisten, and they still look like Clem. You know, you see Clem when you see them. And if we don't take on those challenges of who he was as a man, then the tragedy is we fail them.
All of them. They all had individual stories. They all had individual lives. They all had their families. And to say, I forgive, and everyone's Christian walk is different. And I'm still walking, and I'm still...
I'm wobbling. I'm trying. I'm
trying to get
every
there.
day.
But there has to be understanding. We have to understand what happened that night, and we have to acknowledge it. There's a sense of not wanting to acknowledge that in 2015, 9 individuals, 5 others were terrorized because of the color of their skin.
I think that what happened on the 17th was a part of environmental conditioning. It happened in a church with a group of people at Bible study. And because of the conditions of where they were, what they were doing, and the response of the family, it set the stage for the community to follow the family. Now, yes, it's fine to be angry. Anger is a part of your grieving. It's okay to forgive and still be angry concerning what happened. And so to say I forgive does not negate the fact that it happened. It just means I've made a personal choice. And I think if we say to the family members who said, I forgive, you have no right to do that, that's wrong. No. Because no, I'm not saying you per se, I'm saying there are those who have had that kind of a position. Just as you have the right, I have the right to be angry, someone else has the right to forgive. And one does not have to be absent of the other.
Concern gets to be what happens after the forgiveness. And to a great degree, the governor, and I commend her. I thought that she handled herself well throughout that tragedy. I saw her tears. I believe she was profoundly affected. I believe all of those emotions were heartfelt and not calculated. I don't know of anyone who could have done that better than she did. But to say that we fought it and we won kind of shows the distance that we need to come. Because, you know, a hug is nice, but it would also be nice, as Bakari said, if folk in my presiding elder district in Jasper County had adequate health care, which the governor has not expanded. Hug is nice, but I'd feel more secure if there were more effective gun control laws, which the governor still will not embrace, you know. So I think all of that needs to come into play, and it would be good to hear her acknowledge that we are thankful that we handled this, and we need to deal with the ongoing division and fear and racial animus in our country. You know, hug is nice, but people pet their dogs.
What does it mean that Charleston is being held up as the standard? You mentioned Ferguson, Baltimore,
because
other places. Charleston is now being held up as the standard. This is the way that you should deal with it. This is the way you can deal with it.
You want the real answer?
Yeah.
The real answer is that it's a perception that you had a collection of docile individuals. You had, if you juxtapose the images, you had one which this country cannot take. You had a black power. You had a we're going to take it, and in those places they did take it too far. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but you have to understand why that behavior exists. But in Charleston, you had the perception that we were being docile, so it's easier to swallow. We had a discussion offset about the legacy of Muhammad Ali and how now all of a sudden Muhammad Ali transcended race. No, Muhammad Ali didn't. Muhammad Ali was unapologetically black and unapologetically Muslim, and the 25-year-old Muhammad Ali would not be well liked in today's America. That's a fact. That's who he is. So these images and these perceptions, and it's just more tolerable for people to believe that we like Nikki Haley said, that it's over, that we gave up, that the fight is over. We had an instance, we sang Kumbaya, we walked across the bridge, and now we are comfortable in our circumstances.
Well, to her credit, she did say that the healing has not been complete, that there is still healing to be done. It's the fact that the healing, however, is to be done
Maybe we just have a different definition of
in
what
these
healing looks like.
circumstances.
Healing. If something is healed, it is restored to a state of health. That makes the assumption that you started from a state of health. And when it comes to race in South Carolina, we ain't never done that. That's a long-running sickness and sin. And so it's not just a matter of healing, it's a matter of getting things to an optimal point where they have never been.
One community which sought to be a part of the healing was the arts community. They came together in song, they came together in dance, in words, and in visual arts. And renowned batik artist Leo Twiggs has created something he called Requiem for Mother Emanuel. Let's take a look.
I think I have always done flags ever since the 1970s. I started doing targets in the 1990s. And what happened at Mother Emanuel really crossed paths with that. It was symbols that I had used early on, and everything seemed to come together in that. The flag, I think, is what is the motivating factor for the tragedy. And that's why, in one of them, it's so empowering. And that's why those flags, if you notice them, I have done flags before, but those flags are bloody flags. But the other thing that I noticed that was happening, and I think I noticed this when I started seeing them together, is that through the first three paintings, the flag is a very prominent image. And then it seemed to just fade and kind of dissipate, and then it is no more. As the bloodiness dissipates, the redemptive aspect of what happened to them comes forward. And I don't know, I can't say why it did. I just felt that perhaps I went through this transition to understand that the bloodiness was not the end of it, that there was something beyond that. In the Christian religion, the cross represents the way to salvation. The cross is also the flag. The flag is a St. Andrew's cross. And so what I thought about is, how do you transition a cross that represents the bloodiness of that event to a cross that transcends that? So that's why what turned out as these X's, which marks the spot where people died, turned into crosses. And so in the work, the crosses are always going up. And what used to be the X's where the bodies lay becomes the crosses where they ascend. And it's the transfiguration from the physical to the spiritual. You know, if you go to Charleston and you look at Mother Emanuel, there's a saintly, stark whiteness about it. To me, that saintliness was stained by the flag. And so by creating the flag smaller so that at least it is not completely covering the church, but you see that stain. And I wanted to create that stain, that here was this stark, saintly, white image of a church, and on it there's a stain. I began to think more that Mother Emanuel was not just an isolated event. It was the stony road we traveled. And it was amazing to know that Mother Emanuel was so close to where our ancestors were brought ashore. And so when you listen to Weldon Johnson's poem, We Have Come, he talks about the tears we've come through, and he talks about the slaughtered and the blood that we've traveled through, and that's Mother Emanuel.
Dr. Twiggs paraphrased that great American writer and expatriate James Baldwin, who said, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers." And he went on to say that he suspects that the reason we can't have a conversation about race in this case is because nobody wants to deal with the questions laid bare by the answers. And the answers are the responses that we have seen. The answers are the coming together. But those underlying questions are the things that you have been hinting at in this discussion.
Yeah, I didn't even know I was hinting at them. But it's what has to be explored, and I appreciate that. Dr. Twiggs is one of my heroes, and the arts community's response was marvelous. Within 24 hours, my youngest son is an accomplished artist. Within 24 hours, he had something posted online, and there were other tributes as well. And I think we can learn from that. You know, everybody has some kind of gift, some kind of talent. Wherever you approach it, everybody ought to somehow be able to approach that conversation from where they are, and to ask some very tough questions. You know, South Carolina in general, Charleston in particular, is afflicted with what I call raging politeness. We don't like to get angry about anything, asking polite questions, but you ask those questions. And all of them just spring to mind coming from the Emanuel tragedy. You know, the one that immediately ticked me off. I'm glad they caught the young man quickly in North Carolina. I'd like to know how many other suspects, though, of mass murder that they take to Burger King before they prep him for extradition. You know, interesting questions.
I think I'm at the point, and I think many young African Americans, and this sounds, I mean, to people in the older generation, they'll be like, oh, I can't believe you said that. But I think many younger millennials are becoming exhausted. And it's because we're reliving these types of deaths that it becomes so draining, from, you know, Trayvon Martin to Eric Gardner to Tamir Rice, who was 11 years old, 12 years old. And you just see these instances, and the criminal justice system, or not being able to find a job. And then you're like, okay, well, those things, all those people, you know, maybe they committed a crime, you know, Walter Scott. Maybe they committed a minor violation, but then you have people in Bible study who then get gunned down, and then the excuses that you hear from, you know, all of those people, all of those naysayers, they don't have any then, and it just becomes exhausting that oftentimes you can't think clearly about what the question may be, and so I just rely on some slight civil rights background, and I think the easiest questions for me, at least to formulate, were given by Dr. King in his best book ever. And that's probably because it's this thick and you can read it in a sitting, but he asked two very simple questions. He said, how far have we come, and where do we go from here? And those are the two most profound questions that I can begin to at least analyze and fight through the exhaustion that comes from so much death.
And those are the questions that we will be attempting to deal with in this discussion. But as you look at it, you mentioned Trayvon Martin, and it's interesting to note that Dylann Roof claims to have been upset about the racial situation after reading about the Trayvon Martin incident. So I'm wondering, and I shouldn't call it an incident, the tragedy, and why is it that a Dylann Roof from Central South Carolina can come to such a diabolically opposed position on this issue, with what's being taught in our schools, with the society that we have? Why is it that we can have youth, a millennial, think one way so drastically differently about that situation?
I think we're each a product of our environment. And so if you're in an environment that breathes and lives and sleeps a certain thing, you become a part of it. It becomes natural to you. You become ingrained with it. And to answer the question, why? I don't know. I don't know that anyone knows.
I can give you help, though, answering that question, why. I think Mark Sanford, who's actually a very good friend of mine, he was one of the nicest governors we had. But Mark Sanford always goes back to this book of Thomas Friedman, and it's The World is Flat. And the world is fundamentally flat now. The interconnectivity that we have, the way that you can get into dark spaces and have your mind take you to places, and it, even find a group of people where those norms, which aren't so normal, become socially acceptable. And I think what you had was somebody, and when you turn on Fox News and you see a picture of Trayvon Martin, and all the images you see are in a hoodie or doing whatever, and then you're persecuting the victim, and it happens religiously, then those thoughts are able to fester, and you're able to become that deranged in your own mind.
It's intergenerational, and in a way it is culturally inherited. Part of the problem with race in America is twofold. One, you had people during the time of slavery who considered themselves to be people of faith, but who still owned other people. How do you justify that? You say, these people are not people like us. This is an inferior species. You also have a huge class, a larger class of white folk who are dirt poor, who own no slaves. How do you prevent that dirt poor white class from finding affinity with those slaves? You teach them these people are not only different, they're dangerous. And if you don't help us to control them, they will kill you, they will steal your women, God knows what other brutal things they might do. So that gets passed down through the generations to the point that a Dylann Roof can look at a kid who no doubt was struggling for his life be killed by a larger, older adult and see that kid as a menace. That's why they dredge out the pictures of the hoodie to create that image of menace.
But when you say they, you're talking about the media, you're talking about our institutions of communication and education.
Yes.
And we're all a part of that. We who've been in the legislature, we who are in the media, we who are in the pulpit.
It continues to be Americans' Achilles' heels, the issue of race. We simply, for whatever reason, can't get beyond it. And so whether it's images we see in the media, whether it's you can get lost now on the internet, and you can go to far, dark places to find people who think like you, so you don't have to have a club in South Carolina. You can find folks in Arizona and California or Georgia that have these common themes that you have in common with. And so, as I said earlier, based on Charleston, we have to create space for this conversation to occur. And it's a difficult conversation to have. It really is. It makes people kind of uneasy and squirm in their chairs, but we have to have it because one person said, well, Charleston was about gun violence. And I said, no, Charleston really wasn't about gun violence. The gun was the tool that the perpetrator used to commit the crime, but the crime was hate and racism and discrimination. And until we find space to create this conversation about race, whether it's about what happened in the basement or in our criminal justice, education, healthcare, political images that we see on TV, it will continue to drag down our country.
You have to be you need to kind of be in the system to change the system, to break it apart, to challenge it. I might have said this to Reverend Darby, but anytime I'm around, Nelson Rivers or any of these luminaries, I always joke with them. I said, man, y'all fought the wrong movement in the 60s. The movement shouldn't have been integration. Y'all should have fought for some economic wealth or empowerment, And then I laugh and I joke, hindsight is always the virtue. But then you think about, what did Black Power mean when people were chanting the words Black Power? They weren't talking about any isolationism. They weren't talking about any segregation per se. They were talking about power, meaning wealth, meaning having those things. So when you look at these systems now, we need not just more Black lawyers, but we need more Black judges and Black justices. And when you talk about the fact that whatever the political system may be or the media may be, we need more Black-owned media outlets. You need more African Americans who are the producers and the writers, so you understand and we can have a dialogue about these issues. So we need more people willing to play a role in the process. And when you get in that role, you can't sit on your hands. Now that's the dangerous part, You can't all of a sudden say, I made it.
And you become a part of the existing system.
Correct.
Exactly.
We do well to remember something one of our AME bishops, the late H.H. Brookins, said in a speech I heard once when he was calling for unity. He said, some of us came over on the Mayflower, some of us came over on ships like the Amistad, but we're all in the same boat together now. And that's true. And it means that we have a shared responsibility, regardless of skin color, to try to do those things that whether it is a matter of unity, whether it is a matter of creative confrontation, to make a difference. And we need to understand that it goes beyond black and white, you know. When America has the candidate of one political party who demonizes Mexicans, who demonizes Muslims, who sees a black guy at his rally, probably the only one there, and says, there's my African American. And he's leading and seriously contending, that says something about America's attitude that needs to be changed.
So how do we change it? And what change have we seen as a result of the tragedy a year ago?
I can name one thing. Charleston has what's called a justice ministry, and that justice ministry brings together houses of faith, churches, synagogue, mosque, to look at one issue in the community and then try to figure out how to address that issue. It's been around for about 3-4 years. Now, 3-4 years ago, some of us understood that race was an element in what needed to be changed. Didn't push that because there were some folk at that table who were not ready for that. After Emmanuel, I talked with the lady who does the organizing for us. She said it wasn't a matter, even from the most conservative church folk in there, it was not a question of, is there a racial problem? It's a question of which piece of this do we want to bite off as our problem this year? It confronted that group of people of faith with the essence of America's problem with race. And if you have more of that, then you make a difference.
I just think as we look back a year and the progress we've made progress, slow progress. I think there has been a sense of acknowledgement. I'm certainly, I only can speak for myself in terms of what I've done over the last year, which is try to speak to anyone who's willing to listen about the issues that are impacting our society, dealing with race and racism, using Charleston as the blueprint of what happened and where we must go from here. I've reached out to the church and the church family, and Emmanuel was stronger today than it was a year ago.
I must agree.
And I think that's the foundation where all this starts. And so we're making, step-by-step progress. Are we there yet? Have we reached our destination? No. But there are miles to go, but I'm encouraged that there's people willing to take the journey.
It's almost, though, as if there is this big white elephant in the room, and that white elephant is the issue of race, and people afraid or unable to make that leap that goes from why there is a direct connection or relationship with what happened in this very church and with these issues of racism and the larger issues confronting our society, the overall issues of disparity and bigotry.
I think that's such a true statement. I mean, no one wants to, like Oprah would say, I'm not a big Oprah fan, but she did say one thing, that when a couple argues about the socks in the middle of the floor, it's always about something else, and bigger issues. And the coming together as a community, the Love Fest, doing the community has been so responsive to their humanity. Now it's time to talk about that elephant in the room and create again that space for healthy tension to talk about it. Because at the end of the day, those individuals died that night simply because they were there and that they were black.
And there is that elephant in the room. But from my perspective, there's a dialogue. It may be to a whisper. But I think because it happened in the church and because it happened during Bible study, there are those who do not look like me, they're whispering and they're saying, wow, that's deep. Every day I encounter people who come up to me, either standing on the sidewalk, taking pictures in front of the church, or trying to come into the church to take pictures or to pray or to just assemble. And they're saying to me, I hope you understand that while Dylan was white, that all white people are not like Dylan. He does not stand as the poster child for everyone. That's a dialogue that's starting. Now, where do we go from there? Is that we keep talking, understanding we may not all agree on what is being said, but we need to appreciate that there's a conversation that's starting.
And that can be enhanced if those folks who do that, who come and who acknowledge that there's a problem, when they get back home, figure out, what am I going to do to be a part of fixing that? And it's a tough thing to wrestle with that elephant, because then it means we have to admit that we're not perfect. And all of us like to think that we are perfect. My own, I pastored a church once, not far from the correctional institutions in Columbia, AME Church, many years ago, better than 20 years ago now. A couple came to see their son at one of those institutions. They were a little bit early, white couple, and so they came to the church. I was at the door greeting people as they came, and when they came up, I said, hello, may I help you? And they said, yeah, we want to worship. And I said, welcome, come on in. And it nagged at me when I went back to the pastor's study after that, and I had to admit, as in a growing suburb, with as many new black faces as I saw, why did I ask those two white faces, may I help you? Because I wasn't expecting to see them come to an AME church. That's the kind of revelatory thing that all of us, regardless of color, need to be open to. And that more of my white brothers and sisters really need to be open to, because we might not be as perfect as we think we are.
And
That's
the reason,
a good point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I was going to say the reason that we have to do that is because we can't do this alone.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, we're never going to have a period at the end of that sentence by ourselves.
We have only about a minute remaining. What can we do to honor the memories of those who were slain, to make sure that anniversaries to come, we will not be having the same discussion?
I mean, I don't know what the rest of them plan to do, but you know, I'm gonna I add those 9 people to the list of people that I live for every day. So at the end of the day, I just want my actions to make them proud, and I think that if that's the case, I'll be okay.
I kind of keep on working. Faith without works is dead. Strong faith, but I'm committed to doing the work.
I must examine myself, as Reverend Darby just said, introspection. That is a powerful piece. And I think if we each would just look within and see, where am I on the matter? And then collectively dialogue, and then we can find a path together to move forward.
When I used to do funerals regularly as a pastor, one of the things that I would remind folk was that the best way they could remember their loved ones was to live for the Lord and emulate the best of their behavior, and others could remember them. If we remember the Emmanuel 9 in a way that asks the right questions, that refuses to settle for intolerance, that actively makes us each day see how I can do something differently, who I can reach out to, or how can I speak truth to power, then you start to get a difference.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Dr. Clark, Senator Graham, Mr. Sellers, Elder Darby.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you for joining us.